So we've been discussing our top story of the day, which is Sadiq Khan getting a knighthood. We're trying to come up with reasons why he deserves it. And, well, I won't lie, we're not doing very well at the moment. Still joined by Harrison Allman-Varty, political commentator and young councillor. Where would you like to go next, Harrison? Because I know that we've got this public sector sick day story. Mental health sick days are surging in the public sector much more than the private sector. Now, of course, you'll get some people saying, well, look, the public sector is very, very stressful to work in. That's the reason that this is happening. You'll get other people saying, well, actually, no, hang on. When you work at the public sector, you get full pay when you're on a sick day, probably more pay than you're likely to get in the private sector, and you're able to take longer. So therefore, that's why this is happening. What say you?
I mean, what's stressful is having your own business and if not showing up for the day, meaning that you can't pay your mortgage or your rent, that's stressful. I mean, that's the peak of stressful, knowing that if you actually physically cannot get into work, you cannot pay for things. That's probably the top level. Now, Rachel Reeves talks a good game about increasing productivity, but she ought to look in her own back garden before she starts telling private businesses, because it's no secret that it's the state sector that has constantly lagged behind when it has come to productivity. Especially when you look at major advancements in tech, we still see no shift in the increase in productivity, or major shifts anyway. So perhaps that's a poor adaptation of the public sector. Some NHS services still are adamant on using fax because they think it's just, that's what they do. The public sector is extremely bloated, and as we've seen through a few case studies now, that the number of employees don't exactly always mean output is higher. For example, Elon Musk was absolutely ruthless with Twitter. He sacked, what was it, over half the workforce, I think it was. And that has never been busier. I mean, it's probably died off a little bit now, but it did peak when Musk was in control. I personally think what the Trump administration is looking to do with their Department of Cost Savings, or DOGE, whatever it's called, Government Efficiency, sorry, that will be quite an interesting case study that I think the UK should pay attention to. What happens when you do, treat the public sector as if it's a private company that is trying to drive as much productivity as possible. So yeah, that's my point on it, really.
I think that there's a bigger story here, actually, and I think that it's a story that I really think we need to be talking about more, and that is the good thing, right? It's a good thing we talk about mental health more. It's a good thing that we accept that mental health is something that is serious. I have suffered from, in my past, not anymore really, I'm a much happier person in a really good place, and I have been for many years, but certainly in my 20s and early 30s, I was in a terrible place with my mental health. I was very depressed, I had severe addictions, I had an eating disorder, I had all these sorts of things going on. And I don't say that to be woe is me, I say it because it was happening. And I was open about it, and I used to talk about it, but I never missed a day of work because of it. And that was because, to your point, I couldn't, I was self-employed, I had a mortgage, I had to go to work, I had to. But more importantly, actually, it made me realise that as much as I loathed having to drag my carcass into work, drag myself out of whatever was going on in order just to go to work, that was therapy in itself. And that part of the resilience required when you have a mental health problem is actually getting yourself showered, getting yourself dressed, and getting yourself out the house. And I worry that we focus a lot on the negative of mental health, quite rightly, and we talk about it all, but we don't talk a lot about the coping strategies that are required, the resilience that can fend off that mental health problem, and the benefit of actually going to work, even though it might feel like it is the worst thing in the world to do when you're thinking about it.
You know what? I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's particularly prevalent around young people, right? I think when you're working, right? Whether you really like your job or not is somewhat irrelevant because it gives you a sense of purpose, right? You have a role within a business, and in exchange for the time you give in, you get some money out, right? That gives you a standing and a place, and that is critical for actually strong mental well-being. It gives you something. The worry is that mental health, I think, is at risk, and if not already, being used as a term that is now too broad. And that's seen in the public sector. Now, don't get me wrong, you don't want it to be a restrictive thing, right? But if it's at risk of being abused, the impact of that is, put productivity to the side for a second, the impact of that is people who genuinely do have mental health problems is shadowed then, because you then have people that will claim mental health on things where maybe you just had a bad day. Maybe it's a bad week. Who knows? Maybe a bad
Maybe
quarter.
you do genuinely hate your job. Maybe you are feeling down, and those are valid feelings, but they are a different category to someone who has a real chemical problem. That's someone who is in an absolutely dire cycle of addiction, perhaps, for instance. There are, you're right, different categories of mental health. And again, I think it's important when we have these conversations not to just invalidate anyone who might have a mental health problem or sound like we're trying to generalise things too much. But I just think that we're scared to discuss the solutions for fear of looking like you're being heartless, when in actual fact that's precisely what is needed from people who are having a mental health problem. The other aspect of this, and I'm interested based on your age, so you're 21, about this, and that is, I wonder whether as a society, again with perhaps good intentions, we are creating a situation of mental health problems. Many people who've listened to me for a long time know that I bang on a lot about resilience insofar as we try and legislate now any adversity out of young people's lives. You won't hear opinions you don't like. You won't grow up having to worry about crossing the road, worry about any kind of risk whatsoever. You will be cushioned and you will be coddled from anything adverse that you might encounter, especially in universities, the place where you should encounter it most, because we know it might upset you, when in actual fact it's that resilience that will make you stronger. And so then when they do encounter something that is actually bad, because life is bad sometimes, they just collapse.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. The problem is when you create an environment where you think nothing can go wrong, when even the slightest of thing goes wrong, then it seems like it's the end of the world. The problem is you do need to have bad days to appreciate the good days. That is just a fact of life. I'd be quite interested if they took a poll, or a major poll of uni students and assess their mental health. And then you did that for those who are broadly the same age as those in work. And I bet you that the mental health will be stronger and better than those of the same age who are in work than those who are at university. There is a massive sense at university where you kind of float around, don't do much. Your workload is non-existent. There is no need for these courses to be 3 or 4 years for the average course. It's a case of it can be done in 18 months if they did it 5 days a week. Obviously, the reasons behind that is you then have to pay the rent, you then have to spend more money, take on the loans. There's a big thing behind it, sure. But I think it is an interesting one, because I think you're right in the sense that young people, we've almost like, don't offend them, don't say anything that might upset them, don't give anything that they might not like. And unfortunately,
we're not training young people for adversity. And when I look at our ancestors, our older relatives, and I'm not suggesting that this is a good thing, but the reason I think for a lot of them that their mental health was considered to be better was because they went through wars. They went through literally no heating, toilets outside, like having to walk 5 miles to school. Now, we don't want that for young people, but they had a benchmark. They were able to say, right, you know what? Nothing that I'm going to encounter today is going to be worse than those times. So therefore, I'm all right.
The thing is, Cristo, that young people in this country have never had it so good. It's just a fact, right? Look at me, right? I'm a young counsellor, and people always say to me, oh, but we need more young people in politics, don't you think so? I say, well, if they want to do it, that's fine. I said, but the average 18-year-old doesn't want to be a councillor. They don't really want to be a member of parliament. They don't want to do it, right?
But they also don't want the abuse. Could you imagine? I imagine you get, being, especially having been a Conservative councillor, so much abuse and so much stick for it, and many of your peers, I'm not saying all, but many would probably crumble, right?
I mean, you know, but that's the point. I think the point I'm trying to make is it's a case of, look, it's never been a better time to be a young person in anything, because any company or any organisation is looking to go, look at us, we've got a young person, right? Now, I didn't want that to be my thing. I didn't want to be selected because I'm young. I said, pick me because I've got these 3 objectives that I'd quite like to achieve at a local level, and I think I do a pretty good job at it. And by, you know, the members looked at it and they select me, and that was it. But it's a case of, young people can do whatever they want. It's never been a better time to be a young person in this country. There is so much opportunity. So I would say, I feel like constantly, whether it's, you know, from maybe left-wing media or from teachers, it's often the case of that you're kind of patronised a little bit by saying you're not, you know, don't let them tell you, you know, you can't do this and you can't do that. It's just not the case. It's never been better. There's a lot of reasons why you should be happy, and I'd be quite interested to understand that poll to see what the mental health would be different between workers and those at university.
All right, thanks so much, Harrison.